some of you might be thinking, what in the world is he doing here? But last evening, I overheard someone say that a new law in the state of Rationalia is to include in any PsyCon conference at least one academic talk by an experimental social psychologist. Now, I'm not sure if that is true, but, well, here goes. Claptrap, baloney, buffoonery, codswallop, empty talk, garbage, hogwash, nonsense, poppycock, flapdoodle, flim-flam, flummery, bullshit. What exactly is bullshit? Bullshit is something that emerges when people communicate things with no or little regard for truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. And the behavior of bullshitting involves a broad array of rhetorical strategies that people use to sound like they know what they're talking about when they want to impress others, influence others, persuade others in some way, or when their obligations to share an opinion about something or to explain something far exceed their actual knowledge in that area or domain. Bullshit is often abstract, lacking in sources or logic, oftentimes riddled with acronyms or business speak. But part of what makes bullshit so compelling and appealing is that it often sounds like it's beneficial or confirming or credible. And much of my empirical research to date has focused much on the when problem. When are people likely to bullshit us? Under what conditions are we most likely to be exposed to bullshit? But today I want to share with you some new research I've been working on that addresses the why problem. Why do people bullshit us sometimes? Are there any functions to bullshitting for the bullshitter that might explain why they do it? And it is understanding when and why people bullshit us and when we might be exposed to it that places us in a better position or a better vantage point of understanding when and why we can then better detect and dispose of this unwanted social substance. Now, to be clear, bullshitting is not lying. It's often confused for lying, but bullshitting is not lying. Now, it is true that although the liar and the bullshitter they're both deceptive in the sense that they're trying to appear as though they're interested in the truth. Only the liar is actually interested in the truth. So when someone lies to us, the liar is actually concerned with the truth, and they're trying to get us to believe something that they don't believe is true themselves. So for instance, Plato says, look guys, there will be no jobs lost during the planetary restructuring, and he knows that this is not so, then he's lying. And an important distinction that comes with lying is the social consequences that we have for liars. We're not usually happy with people who lie to us, and there are great consequences for lying. Now, the bullshitter, on the other hand, doesn't care at all about truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. They're not even paying any attention to it. Whereas the liar doesn't believe what they say is true, the bullshitter really has no clue, no idea as to whether or not what they say is true. And in fact, every once in a while, just by chance, by accident, the bullshitter actually says something that is true. But even they wouldn't know it because they're not paying any attention to truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge that might otherwise support their claims. So they may say the same thing as the liar. Hey, look guys, no jobs lost. If Plato really doesn't know what he's talking about, then he's bullshitting. And again, the social distinction, the social reaction to bullshitting is different from that of lying. It's usually passed off as a mild social offense. and we assume that it's relatively harmless. But I want to show you today, through 4 studies, I want to share with you that we can't be more wrong, that it's harmless. The most ideal form of communication is, of course, evidence-based communication. Now, if Plato persists in his claim, look, guys, no job's lost, and he's considered the evidence, then he's not bullshitting and he's not lying. Now, he may still be wrong. Evidence-based communication does not guarantee truth and correctness. But at least there is some concern for it, and that's what distinguishes evidence-based communication from bullshitting and lying. Now, again, there are great consequences to lying. However, the consequences for leaning into bullshit are much less severe. So lying or spreading disinformation may get you fired, right, or may get you canceled. But bullshitting, on the other hand, might be that it helps promote you to CEO. Hell, you might even become president. But Harry Frankfurt, the philosopher that first defined what I call Frankfurtian bullshitting, developed a hypothesis that it actually puzzled him. He said with these consequences for lying and bullshitting being different, he actually thought that bullshitting was worse than lying because truth is paramount. And at least the liar has some interest in the truth. So he didn't see the liar as bad as the bullshitter. He said that given these different consequences, that was puzzling to him because he thought that bullshit was more damaging to society. And I've been calling this the Frankfurtian bullshit hypothesis. It doesn't go in great detail as to why this hypothesis might be supported, but he also does imply that perhaps, maybe in the world there's just more bullshit than there is lies, and then that would support the hypothesis. But in my bullshit studies lab, we've considered 2 other possibilities. One, that bullshit might be more influential, could be more persuasive than evidence-based communication under some conditions, and lies. And 2, perhaps bullshit interferes with memory more than lies, and thereby has a greater impact on beliefs about what is true. And what we believe to be true is critical to optimal decision-making and judgment. Now, if either of these 2 things are true, that bullshit is more influential or that it interferes with memory, this would be support for the insidious bullshit hypothesis. So we conducted 4 studies that I want to tell you about today. And across the 4 studies, they use 3 classic procedural paradigms. In our first experiment, we borrowed from a classic persuasion paradigm. And we wanted to know, does it influence attitudes and beliefs when examined in light of this procedural paradigm? We had 500 college students. They were led to believe that administrators were considering a new policy that would require seniors to pass a qualifying exam in their major as a requirement for graduation. And most students hate this idea, as you might imagine. But we tried to persuade them that this is actually a good idea. And our participants were given either weak or strong arguments. If they were in the weak arguments condition, they got arguments like, hey, Duke University is doing it, right? But if they were in the strong arguments condition, they said, well, students who come from programs with qualifying exams, they earn more in their starting salary than students who don't come from these programs. But importantly, we took the very same arguments, both weak and strong arguments, and we framed them from a communicator in bullshit frames that clearly communicated to our participants that they didn't really care about the research. They didn't care what was going on at Duke University. They thought this was a good idea. or they were crossed with evidence-based frames where the communicator clearly states that, you know what, I've looked at the research and I'm concerned about the evidence. Our analysis showed a clear evidence of what we call an argument quality effect, but only within the evidence-based frames, okay? Which traditionally suggests to us a queuing of what we call central route processing, whereby persuasion occurs only when arguments themselves are compelling. However, nothing going on in the bullshit frame condition suggests to us that bullshitting might cue what we call peripheral route processing, whereby persuasion can occur when superficial cues, like the number of arguments or attributes of the communicator, are compelling. Now, theoretically, we're also interested in this data from another angle. Relative to evidence-based frames, bullshit frames appeared to weaken the potency of strong arguments, yet strengthen the potency of weak arguments. And this was quite remarkable to us, given that the arguments in the weak conditions, they're the very same arguments. They only differ in what they signal about the intentions of the communicator as they pertain to their concern for truth and evidence. Now, theoretically, there are two routes to persuasion. In both of these routes, they depend almost entirely on three components. They depend on one's cognitive ability to process a message, also their opportunity, their cognitive resources at the time to process this information, and their general motivation to process the information in the first place. And when people follow the central route processing because they have the ability, the opportunity, and the motivation to consider a message, they tend to listen carefully and think about the quality of the arguments presented. They're the ones that understand the difference between strong and weak arguments. However, when people follow the peripheral route processing, because they either lack the motivation or they lack the opportunity or the ability to think about the arguments in a persuasive communication, they may be swayed by more superficial cues like simply the credibility of the source or source attractiveness and the number of arguments in the message, but not the quality of the arguments. So we tested this possibility in another persuasion experiment. In this time, the attitude object was one that students liked. The attitude object was an extended 2-week spring break. Okay? But we tried to persuade participants that this was actually a bad idea. So the lower the score, the lower the attitude score indicated more persuasion in this study. And because evidence-based frames appeared to prompt central route processing in our first experiment, we expected argument quality to once again matter only in the evidence-based frames. Okay? But because source attractiveness is traditionally a peripheral route cue, we expected source attractiveness to matter only when participants were bullshitted by the same arguments. Now again, this time, lower scores indicated more persuasion. As expected, argument quality made a difference, but only when the arguments were presented in evidence-based frames. It didn't matter at all when the same arguments were presented in bullshit frames, when people probably aren't listening very carefully to the quality of the arguments. But also, what did matter in bullshit frames was the source attractiveness. Attractive sources were much more influential, lower scores, than their unattractive counterparts. But the difference in attractiveness, it didn't appear in the evidence-based frames, when arguments were provided by evidence-based frames. So now these are two studies, two persuasion studies, that both support the insidious bullshit hypothesis. We wanted to take a closer look at the hypothesis and borrow from another traditional experimental paradigm. This time we used the sleeper effect paradigm. And the sleeper effect is simply a delay in the persuasiveness of a persuasive attempt. Okay? And the best way to demonstrate a sleeper effect is to simply give people positive information about a novel object. Okay? It could be a product or it could be a person. And right away, if that's the only information that they have, if you measure their attitude, they tend to show relatively positive attitudes. But if a little while later you give them negative information about the same attitude object, or you tell them something negative about the source of the initial message, they tend to discount the initial source and adjust their attitudes downward, okay, almost immediately. However, with the passage of time, usually 1 week later or 2 weeks later, there tends to be a rebounding of the positive attitude in the direction of the initial information. It's almost as if the initial message retains a more persistent hold on the attitude. And the primary explanation for this effect is one of differential decay. And that is that the discounting cue, which comes second, it tends to be forgotten sooner than the initial information. And this produces this rebounding effect that we call the sleeper effect. So we subjected our hypothesis to this paradigm. And in our experiment, we used a fictitious pizza. We told all of our participants all the nice things about Chow's Pizza, all positive information. But then 2/3 of our participants, a little while later, we said, there's this consumer protection agency that found either that the advertising company of Chow's Pizza had several lies in their advertisement, or they had a lot of bullshit in their advertisement. And we told them what bullshit meant, what we mean by bullshit. And then 1/3 of the participants were never given the discounting cue at all. That was our control. When we measured attitudes immediately, we found that in the control condition that did not get the discounting cue, they were relatively positive about Chow's Pizza. All right? But relative to the control, both the lie and the bullshit versions that received the discounting cues, they reduced their positivity about Chow's Pizza when measured immediately, as you can see here. Right? Now, we had participants come back to the bullshit studies lab 2 weeks later, and we just reminded them of the attitude object that we told them about and had them read about 2 weeks earlier. We didn't give them the information again, we just informed them, hey, remember the Chow's Pizza. All right? Then we measured their attitudes about Chow's Pizza again. And what we see is a sleeper effect only occurring in the lie and the bullshit condition. So it was a rebound towards the initial information. They weren't so negative. What we found most interesting was, once again, consistent with the insidious bullshit hypothesis. Not only did the bullshit discounting cue result in more positive attitudes over time compared to the lie condition, the bullshit condition's attitudes returned to a level that wasn't even different from the control condition, as if they had never received a discounting cue in the first place. A level that didn't occur in the lying condition. Relative to the control, the lying condition still showed the sleeper effect, but it wasn't as extreme as it was in the bullshit condition. Right, and in our final experiment, we borrowed from another traditional procedure known as the illusory truth procedure. And first, I need to tell you that when something is perceived to be fluent, it's perceptually fluent. What we mean by that is that it's easy to process. It's easy to think about. And if we've noticed something before, we've read something before, we've seen something before, it's just easier to recognize that same information. It's easier to mentally process, and we oftentimes take that relative ease to signal truth. We confuse it for truth. And the easiest way to demonstrate the illusory truth effect is to give people some information, some new information, some names or statements, and just expose them to that. And then this initial information, this initial exposure, will set a contrast with subsequent new information that was not previously processed. This previously processed information is relatively more perceptually fluent than the new information. And again, it's this difference in perceptual fluency that is oftentimes confused for truth. In our experiment, we used several dozens of statements like these. Chemosynthesis is the name of the process by which plants make their food. Steinbeck is the last name. The author of The Agony and the Ecstasy. Abafi is the old number 2 wood in golf. And Billy the kid's last name is Garrett. If you're wondering, these are all false. Okay? These are not true. Okay? But in our first phase of our experiment, we just wanted to expose participants to these stimuli. So we just asked, how interesting are the statements? We didn't really even care how interested they were in the statements. But then this was our way of making sure that we can repeat some information later. So later, we asked participants to rate how much they believed these and other statements, similar statements, to be true. Okay? Importantly, some of the statements in the second phase were repeated, some were new, some of the statements were false, and some of them were true, half and half. And importantly, a manipulation that we included were instructions that we allegedly gave to the authors of the statements. Okay? 1/3 of the participants were simply told, hey, half of the statements are true, half of them are false. Okay? But 1/3 of the participants were told, well, the instructions that we gave to the author was to include, to their knowledge, half of the items that are true and to lie on another half of the items. Okay? And in the bullshit condition, we told them, we want you to include half of the statements that you know to be true and another half that you don't really know to be true. Don't worry about evidence or anything of that. You could just put together anything that you want. We were also interested in whether or not telling them about the falsity of some information, the placement of it coming before the initial exposure, the interest rating task, or coming after the interest rating task. When it came to giving them the heads up, the warning that they're going to get some false information to rate, our author condition, control, liar, and bullshit, really didn't matter. There was no significant difference between these three conditions. Okay? They didn't differ in their illusory truth effect as the conditions pertain to the three different authors. All right? Also not reflected here, the more times that we presented a statement, if it was presented 3 times or 4 times, the illusory truth effect increased greatly. And I used to think about this effect, thinking that maybe it took 16 times to hear something or 32 times to hear something that wasn't true and start to believe that it's actually false. But it doesn't take 16 nor 32. It takes one exposure to generate an illusory truth effect. A single exposure that is then repeated a second time, you can gather illusory truth effects. But what we did find among the participants who were forewarned that there were some false information after the initial exposure. It would come out as, hey, by the way, half of the things that we had you rate for interest, half of them were false. We observed a drop in truth ratings for the control condition and the liar condition. So it was almost as if they corrected for this, the fact that they had been lied to. And we find this is consistent once again with the insidious bullshit hypothesis, because the bullshit condition did not correct for this forewarning. They retained the same degree of illusory truth that they had if the warning was given before the actual exposure in the interest rating task. So this shows an illusory truth effect that's stronger or more persistent for bullshit than both lies or just telling them the truth. Now, people often think that bullshit is harmless. And I've demonstrated now through 4 experiments that bullshit can be more influential than lies, and under some conditions, even more influential than evidence, providing support for Harry Frankfurt's implied insidious bullshit hypothesis. Now, we also have a bit of an answer to the why problem. And why people bullshit us may be very well be because it appears to work in favor of the bullshitter, to the detriment of those exposed to bullshit. Now, I've shown you 4 experiments, but I actually, in our bullshit studies lab, we have about 4 dozen experiments. And they all show 2 things. They all suggest 2 things. One, that bullshit is different from lies, it's a different behavior, and there are different consequences associated with them. And that we may be better off treating lies and bullshit in the very same way. To treat bullshit, even though we might think it's relatively harmless, to treat it just as we do lies. And if you're still skeptical, you're not convinced about all of this, well, maybe you just ask Edgar Welch, the Comet Ping Pong pizzeria gunman, if he still believes that bullshit is harmless. With just a little concern for truth, access to readily available evidence, and perhaps treating bullshit as falsely as we do lies until otherwise supported by evidence can make all the difference. Now, in with that, thank you.